20 consultants, each commanding fees in the tens of millions of dollars, sat around the same polished table and arrived, one after another, at the exact same conclusion. Shut the project down. Every member of the board nodded in agreement. The motion moving down the table like a wave, nobody wanted to stop. Until the silence in the room felt like a verdict already written and sealed. Evelyn Carter, the chief executive of Carter Dynamics, held the final approval document in her hand, the pen resting against the paper, ready to sign the order that would end the most ambitious undertaking of her career. Then, from the far end of the room, a man rose slowly from his chair, unhurried, almost as if he had been waiting for exactly this moment and no other. He held no Harvard degree. He was not a consultant, not a strategist, not anyone whose name had ever once appeared in a business headline. He was Daniel Brooks, an operations manager and a single father who had spent 12 years learning the company from the inside out, floor by floor, system by system. His first sentence was enough to silence the entire room. "Because all of you," he said quietly, "are analyzing a company that no longer exists." Evelyn Carter was 35 years old, sharp, decisive, and widely regarded as one of the most promising chief executives in the entire technology industry. Under her leadership, Carter Dynamics had become one of the fastest-growing artificial intelligence companies in the country. A firm that investors once described in glowing terms as unstoppable, a company that seemed destined to define the next decade of its field. But inside that success sat a wound that refused to heal, a project called Orion, into which the company had poured nearly $400 million over 3 consecutive years without ever turning a profit. Shareholders had grown restless, their patience worn thin by quarter after quarter of disappointing updates. The stock price had been sliding for months, and the pressure from major investment funds had become impossible to ignore, arriving in the form of terse letters and increasingly blunt phone calls. If Orion failed publicly now, in the middle of an already difficult year, Evelyn understood that her own position as chief executive would very likely fail right along with it. To settle the matter once and for all, and perhaps to give the board political cover for whatever decision followed, they had hired 20 of the most respected consultants in the world, drawn from firms whose names alone commanded instant respect in boardrooms across the country. Their fees alone ran into the tens of millions of dollars, a staggering sum that some inside the company had quietly questioned even before the reports were finished. Their conclusion, delivered independently yet somehow perfectly identical across all 20 teams, was simple and final: cut the losses and walk away. The room that morning carried a particular kind of heaviness, the kind that settles over a company when everyone already senses which way the decision is going to fall long before anyone actually says the words out loud. Evelyn had read every report twice, had sat through hours of presentations filled with elegant charts and confident probability models, and had found herself, almost against her will, nodding along with the growing consensus in the room. The numbers were consistent from one firm to the next. The language was confident, measured, entirely free of doubt. 20 separate teams, using 20 separate methodologies and 20 separate sets of analysts, had somehow landed on the exact same recommendation, and there is a particular kind of persuasion in that sort of unanimity that is very difficult for even a strong leader to resist. The room itself seemed built for exactly this kind of moment. All glass and dark wood. 40 floors above a city that never once paused to notice the small dramas playing out above it. Outside the windows, the late afternoon light had begun to fade into a dull gray. And somewhere far below, delivery trucks and taxis moved through the streets, with no idea that a decision worth hundreds of millions of dollars was quietly being finalized above them. Evelyn had been chief executive for just under 4 years, promoted young after the sudden departure of her predecessor. And in that time she had learned to read a room the way other people read a balance sheet. She knew, without needing to be told, that the mood in this particular room had already settled into agreement long before the vote was formally called, and she knew how rare it was for 20 independent teams to land on the exact same page without a single dissenting voice among them. She glanced around the table at faces she trusted, people who had guided the company through difficult years before this one, people whose judgment she had relied on more than once when the path forward seemed unclear. She felt the weight of the pen in her hand growing heavier with every passing second, as though the decision had already made itself somewhere outside of her control, and all that remained was the formality of her signature. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a small and stubborn voice kept asking whether unanimous agreement was truly the same thing as being right. But the voice was faint, easily drowned out by the sheer volume of expertise arrayed in front of her. It seemed, in that moment, that the decision had already been settled long before she was ever asked to actually make it. The lawyers had reviewed the language. The board had reviewed the numbers. All that remained was ink on paper, and the quiet, awful sense that something enormous was about to end. Daniel Brooks was 38 years old. A man who had started his career as a field engineer, hands covered in grease and cable dust. Long before anyone in the executive suite knew his name, he had grown up in a small town outside Pittsburgh, the son of a factory foreman, and had learned early in life that the people closest to a problem usually understood it better than the people writing memos about it from a distance. After his wife passed away when their daughter was still small, he had raised the girl mostly on his own, juggling early shifts and late meetings around school pickups and pediatrician appointments, a routine that had taught him more about patience and priorities than any leadership seminar ever could have. He had worked his way up through the operations division over more than a decade, one promotion at a time, each one earned through results rather than connections. He had no polished resume to speak of, no advanced degree from a prestigious institution framed on his wall, and no reputation beyond the walls of the company where he had quietly, steadily built his career. Yet in those 12 years, he had come to understand something that none of the consultants sitting in that room truly understood, because none of them had ever needed to understand it. He knew the entire chain of the business, from the factory floor to the data center, to the moment a customer opened the product for the first time, and either loved it or quietly gave up on it. When the vote was called, and every hand in the room rose in agreement, one after another in a slow, dutiful wave, Daniel's hand stayed exactly where it was, resting flat on the table in front of him. The stillness of that single hand drew every eye in the room toward him, and for a moment nobody quite knew what to make of it, whether it was defiance or simply an oversight. One of the senior consultants, a man used to rooms bending easily to his opinion, let out a short laugh and asked whether Daniel truly believed he understood the situation better than 20 teams of trained specialists with decades of combined experience between them. A few quiet chuckles rippled around the table, the kind of laughter people offer when they want to signal agreement without saying a word themselves. Daniel did not raise his voice, and he did not flinch at the laughter the way a lesser man might have. He simply said that he did not believe he knew more than 20 teams of specialists, only that all 20 of them appeared to have made the exact same mistake, and that a shared mistake, however confidently stated, does not become the truth simply because everyone agrees on it. The room fell quiet again, though this time the quiet felt different, less certain than before. At first, almost no one in the room wanted to hear what Daniel had to say, and a few board members exchanged glances that suggested they viewed the interruption as little more than an inconvenience. One board member, a stern woman who had sat on the board longer than almost anyone else present, suggested, not unkindly but firmly, that perhaps the meeting had already run its course and it was time to move toward a final vote before the day slipped away entirely. But Evelyn lifted a hand and asked the room to wait, telling them simply, in a voice that left no room for argument, to let the man speak for 5 minutes and no more. Daniel walked to the front of the room without opening a single slide, without a deck of charts trailing behind him, without a projector humming to life on the wall, as everyone had grown accustomed to seeing. He picked up a marker from the tray beneath the whiteboard, wrote 4 words across its surface in plain block letters, "Question your assumptions," and turned back to face the room with the marker still loosely in his hand. He asked a simple question, one that sounded almost too basic for a room full of highly paid experts. What data had the 20 reports actually used to build their revenue projections? The answer came back, a little hesitantly, that the projections were built largely on data collected roughly 3 years earlier, supplemented with more recent figures where available. Daniel asked whether the company's customers today looked anything like the customers of 3 years ago. whether their needs, their expectations, and their competitors had remained frozen in place while the rest of the industry moved forward around them. For the first time since the meeting began, nobody in the room offered an immediate answer, and the silence that followed lasted just long enough to feel uncomfortable. He pressed further, asking how many people in the room had personally spoken with a customer using Orion within the past 30 days. A long pause followed before one consultant admitted that her team had relied on survey data collected by a third-party research firm rather than direct conversation. Daniel nodded slowly, not unkindly, and pointed out that surveys measure what people are willing to write down, not necessarily what they actually experience day to day on the factory floor or in a support queue at midnight. He reminded the room that a customer frustrated enough to consider canceling a contract rarely fills out a satisfaction survey with careful, measured language. More often, that frustration shows up first in a phone call nobody logs properly, or a quiet decision made months before any formal cancellation notice arrives. Several people around the table shifted in their seats, the kind of small, involuntary movement that betrays discomfort before words ever catch up to it. Piece by piece, calmly and without theatrics, without raising his voice or reaching for dramatic language, Daniel began to take apart the assumptions sitting quietly beneath every single one of those 20 confident, expensive reports. He was not attacking the consultants themselves, he made clear, only the ground they had chosen to build their conclusions on. What Daniel revealed next reshaped the tone of the entire room in a way that no chart or graph had managed to do all morning. All 20 reports, he explained, had drawn from the same underlying data set, built on the same forecasting models, and structured around the same basic assumptions about the market and the customer. It was no coincidence at all that they had reached the same conclusion, he said, because agreement built on a shared blind spot is not evidence of truth. It is simply evidence of a shared mistake, repeated 20 separate times by 20 separate teams. He laid out, point by point, everything the reports had failed to capture in their careful spreadsheets and elegant summaries. Enterprise customers had shifted their expectations dramatically over the past year. The broader artificial intelligence industry had entered an entirely new and unfamiliar phase of maturity. Competitors had already begun quietly repositioning their own offerings to match that shift. And the market itself had reversed direction, while the reports on the table remained frozen in the assumptions of years past. Confidence in the room, so solid and unshakable just minutes earlier, began to visibly crack along its edges. Consultants who had spoken with absolute certainty only an hour before now found themselves exchanging uneasy glances across the table, unsure how to respond to a man who had never once opened a spreadsheet in front of them, who had built his entire case on nothing but a whiteboard and a handful of pointed questions. One younger analyst tried to interject with a counterpoint about historical churn rates, but Daniel simply asked when that data had last been refreshed, and the analyst's answer trailed off into an admission that it had not been refreshed in nearly 2 years. Evelyn watched all of this unfold from her seat at the head of the table, the pen still resting untouched beside the unsigned document, and felt something shift inside her chest that she could not immediately name. It was not yet trust, not fully, but it was something close to it. A crack of doubt that had opened where only minutes ago there had been none at all. The room, once united in its certainty, now felt fractured, uneven, waiting for something more before it could settle back into any single opinion. Then Daniel shared something that no one else in that room could possibly have known. Something none of the 20 painstakingly researched reports had even come close to touching. Over the previous 6 months, he explained, he had worked directly alongside the operations teams handling Orion's day-to-day deployment, sitting in on calls, walking factory floors, listening to complaints that never made it into any formal report. Through that work, he had learned that a major European partner was on the verge of signing a strategic agreement worth billions of dollars, a deal that had been quietly progressing through legal review for months, without ever once appearing on the radar of the executive floor. If Orion continued to exist, that partner intended to move forward with the signing within the current quarter, based on assurances the operations team had already given them in good faith. If Orion were shut down, As the 20 reports recommended, the agreement would collapse automatically, along with any trace of the opportunity it represented, and likely along with the partners' trust in the company more broadly. None of the 20 consulting firms had any knowledge of this pending deal, because their work had been built entirely on historical data and market modeling rather than direct, ongoing contact with the people actually running the business day to day, in real time, with real customers on the other end of the line. It was a piece of the puzzle that existed only on the ground, far from any spreadsheet or forecasting model, and it had never once made its way into a single one of the reports sitting on the table in front of Evelyn. For the first time that morning, the room did not just grow quiet. It grew visibly unsettled. Chairs shifting, papers being reshuffled, several board members glancing toward one another as though silently asking whether anyone else had known about this and simply failed to mention it. Evelyn set the pen down entirely now, no longer even pretending to hold it in readiness, and asked Daniel directly how confident he was in what he had just told the room. He answered without hesitation that he had spoken with the partner's regional director himself, twice, within the past month, and that the confidence in continuing forward had been unmistakable both times. One of the senior consultants, visibly rattled, asked why none of this had ever been escalated through proper channels if it was truly as significant as Daniel claimed. Daniel answered that he had, in fact, mentioned it in 2 separate operations updates over the past quarter, both of which had been summarized into a single bullet point buried on the 9th page of a much longer document that, as far as he could tell, no one on the executive team had actually read in full. He was not accusing anyone in the room of dishonesty, he clarified, only pointing out how easily an important detail could disappear inside a process built to compress 1,000 small truths into a handful of tidy slides. Evelyn felt a flush of something uncomfortably close to embarrassment at that, recognizing her own signature on the very summary he was describing, a document she now realized she had skimmed rather than truly read during a particularly hectic week. It was, she would later admit privately, the moment she understood that the failure sitting in front of her was not really about 20 consultants at all, but about a system that had quietly taught everyone inside it to trust the summary over the source. Evelyn was not yet ready to accept Daniel's account on faith alone, however persuasive it had sounded inside that boardroom. However much the mood in the room had shifted in his favor, in the days that followed, she asked him to take her through the company the way he actually saw it, stripped of filters and formal presentations, and together they visited the data centers where Orion actually ran around the clock, humming with servers that never slept. She sat down with the sales teams who spoke to customers every single day, absorbing their frustration and their hope in equal measure, and walked the floor of the manufacturing facility, where the hardware supporting Orion was assembled by hand in some sections and by machine in others. She met directly with several of the company's largest clients, listening to grievances that had never once reached her desk in any formal complaint. It was, remarkably, the first time in years that a chief executive of Carter Dynamics had gone straight to the people on the front lines, instead of relying entirely on filtered reports, passed carefully up through layers of management, each layer softening or reshaping the truth just slightly before it reached the top. What she found lined up, again and again, almost eerily, with everything Daniel had told the board that morning. Customers were not rejecting the product itself, as the consultants' reports had confidently assumed based on churn data and cancellation surveys. They were rejecting the clumsy, poorly supported way the product had been implemented inside their own businesses, left to struggle without proper training or follow-up. One client, a logistics company in the Midwest, told her plainly that the technology itself was excellent, but that nobody had ever shown their staff how to use it properly, and that two separate support tickets had gone unanswered for over a month. Another client, a regional healthcare network, said something almost identical, describing a powerful tool buried under a mountain of confusing onboarding documents nobody had time to read. At the data center, Evelyn stood beside a technician named Grace Whitfield, who had worked overnight shifts monitoring the Orion servers for nearly 2 years, and asked her, plainly, what she thought was actually wrong with the project. Grace answered without hesitation, telling her that the system itself rarely failed, but that every time a client called in confused or frustrated, the ticket sat in a queue for days because there simply were not enough trained people to answer it properly. On the factory floor, a line supervisor named Marcus Hale echoed nearly the same complaint, saying that engineering kept building improvements, nobody downstream had the resources to actually deliver to customers. By the end of that week, Evelyn had filled 3 full notebooks with quotes and observations that bore almost no resemblance to the polished summaries she had been handed months earlier, and she found herself wondering, uncomfortably, how much other truth had been quietly filtered out of every report that ever reached her desk. Slowly, deliberately, a very different picture of the truth began to take shape in front of Evelyn. One built not from models and projections, but from actual conversations with actual people, and it was a picture that no $20 million report had managed to capture in all its careful analysis. From that foundation, walking the halls of a factory floor and standing in server rooms lit by rows of blinking lights, Daniel proposed something that no one else in the company had dared to suggest in the entire 3 years of Orion's troubled existence. He did not recommend shutting the project down, and he did not recommend pouring another few $100 million into an approach that clearly was not working. Instead, he laid out a far narrower, far more disciplined plan built entirely around what he had learned firsthand. Change the sales strategy to match how customers actually made decisions, rebuild the deployment team around dedicated specialists who stayed with each client through the entire rollout, overhaul the customer support systems that had been leaving tickets unanswered for weeks, adjust the pricing structure to better reflect the value customers actually received, and reallocate the existing resources more intelligently across the organization rather than simply asking for more money. The entire plan, by his own careful calculation, would cost roughly 8% of what the original expansion strategy had called for. A fraction of the sum the board had been debating for months. He presented the plan not as a single dramatic gesture but as a sequence of small testable steps, each one designed to prove itself before the next began. The first phase, he explained, would focus on just 12 of the company's largest and most frustrated accounts, giving each one a dedicated specialist for 90 days to see whether direct attention actually changed outcomes before rolling the approach out company-wide. If those 12 accounts showed measurable improvement, the second phase would expand the model to the next 100 clients, then the next, scaling only as fast as the results justified. He also proposed cutting 3 underperforming initiatives that had quietly drained the budget for over a year without anyone questioning them closely, redirecting that money toward the deployment specialists instead of asking the board for a single additional dollar. It was, in its own way, a far more conservative plan than anything the 20 consultants had proposed, built on evidence gathered one conversation at a time, rather than projected forward from a spreadsheet. Several senior leaders pushed back hard against the proposal, calling the approach reckless and warning that it staked the company's remaining credibility on the instincts of a single operations manager with no formal strategic training and no track record at this level of decision-making. One board member asked, pointedly, what would happen if Daniel turned out to be wrong, if the European deal fell through anyway despite his assurances, if the customers he had spoken to turned out to be outliers rather than a genuine pattern. Daniel's answer was steady and direct, delivered without defensiveness or hesitation. Shutting the project down, he said, was the far greater risk, one dressed up to look safe simply because it matched what everyone in the room had already been told, again and again, to expect. He added that safety built on outdated assumptions was not really safety at all, only comfort disguised as caution, and that the company would be trading a difficult but survivable risk for a quiet, certain loss. Evelyn now stood at the edge of the most consequential decision of her career, with 20 expert reports pulling her firmly one way, and a single operations manager, armed with nothing but first-hand knowledge and quiet conviction, pulling her the other. In the end, after 3 sleepless nights spent reading the same figures over and over until the letters seemed to blur together, Evelyn signed the document, but it was not the order to shut Orion down that everyone in that boardroom had expected. It was an order to restructure the project from the ground up, built almost entirely around the plan Daniel had laid out over the preceding weeks. with his fingerprints visible in nearly every line of the revised strategy. She called a smaller meeting the morning before the announcement, just the board and a handful of senior leaders, to explain her reasoning one final time before the decision became public and irreversible. She told them plainly that she had not made the decision out of loyalty to Daniel personally, and certainly not out of any dismissal of the consultant's expertise, but because she had spent 2 weeks testing his claims against reality herself and had found them holding steady every single time. While the 20 reports, when placed against the same reality, had begun to fall apart at the seams, one board member, the same stern woman who had once suggested ending the meeting early, told her afterward, quietly and without an audience, that it was the first time in years she had seen a chief executive actually change her mind in that room instead of simply confirming what everyone already expected to hear. Evelyn thanked her, though she privately wondered whether the compliment was really about her at all, or about the man standing quietly near the back of the room who had made it possible. The reaction was immediate and largely unkind, arriving faster than she had braced herself for. Financial commentators questioned her judgment openly on television and in print, some suggesting she had let sentiment cloud what should have been a straightforward business decision, and the stock price continued its decline for several more weeks despite her public assurances. The press ran story after story, suggesting the young chief executive had gambled the company's future on the word of a man nobody outside the organization had ever heard of, and one particularly harsh headline referred to her decision as a costly act of misplaced loyalty. All 20 consulting firms, in one form or another, restated their original position in follow-up statements, and predicted, with the same confident language they had used from the beginning, that the restructuring would fail within the year and cost the company even more than an outright shutdown would have. One columnist wrote an entire piece comparing Evelyn's decision to a gambler doubling down after a bad hand, arguing that sentiment had no place in a boardroom where hundreds of millions of dollars hung in the balance. Inside the company, morale wavered as well. Several senior engineers quietly updated their resumes, unsure whether the restructuring would hold together long enough to matter, and 2 members of the original leadership team asked to be reassigned away from Orion entirely rather than risk their names being attached to what still looked, from the outside, like a slow-motion failure. Evelyn fielded phone calls from nervous board members almost daily during those first difficult weeks, each one asking, in slightly different words, whether she was certain she had made the right call. Daniel took direct responsibility for implementation, stepping fully into a role far larger than anything his title had ever suggested, working alongside the operations team through long nights and difficult early mornings as the new plan slowly took shape across every corner of the company. He personally trained several of the new deployment specialists himself, sat in on customer calls late into the evening, and rewrote parts of the onboarding documentation that clients had complained about for months. His young daughter, waiting at home most nights with her grandmother, became something of a quiet motivation he rarely spoke about openly, a reminder of exactly what was riding on getting this right. There were setbacks along the way that never made it into any press release. A pilot rollout with one of the 12 test accounts stalled badly in its second week, and Daniel spent an entire weekend on site with the client's team, untangling a technical misunderstanding that had nearly derailed the entire first phase before it truly began. Within a few months, the first small signs of change began to appear across the company, quiet at first, easy to miss unless someone was looking closely at the right numbers, but undeniably there for anyone willing to pay attention. 1 year later, almost to the exact week of that original boardroom meeting, Orion had become the fastest-growing product line in the company's entire portfolio, a transformation that surprised even some of the people who had championed the restructuring from the very beginning. Revenue climbed steadily quarter after quarter, each report slightly better than the one before it, and the European partners signed the very agreement Daniel had described in that boardroom, worth well over $2 billion across its full term. The company's stock price recovered fully within 8 months, and then surpassed its previous highs by the end of the year, drawing renewed attention from analysts who had written the company off entirely. The deployment team Daniel had rebuilt now numbered nearly 90 specialists, each one trained personally under a program he had designed himself, and average response time on support tickets had fallen from 11 days to under 6 hours. Grace Whitfield, the overnight technician who had once told Evelyn the plain truth about understaffed queues, was promoted to lead a new customer success division built entirely around the lessons learned that year. Marcus Hale's factory floor became a model site that other divisions across the company began touring for ideas. A strange and welcome reversal for a man who had spent years feeling unheard by people several floors above him. Investment funds that had pulled back sharply a year earlier began returning to the table one by one, some of them publicly acknowledging in investor letters that their own earlier assessments had been built on assumptions that no longer matched reality on the ground. A handful of the original 20 consultants, to their credit, admitted openly in industry interviews that their models had failed to capture the situation as it actually existed inside the company, a rare and somewhat uncomfortable admission for firms built on the promise of certainty. Evelyn was named Executive of the Year by a leading business publication, an honor that, under ordinary circumstances, would have marked the undisputed high point of any career in her position. Yet she understood, more clearly than anyone, watching from the outside possibly could, that the person who had truly earned that recognition was not sitting on any stage accepting an award or fielding questions from reporters. When a journalist asked her, during the interview accompanying the award, what had actually changed inside the company over the past year, she surprised the reporter by not mentioning revenue figures or stock prices at all, and instead described the small, deliberate habit she had built of walking the factory floor once a month, unannounced, simply to ask people what was actually happening in their corner of the business. She thought often, in quiet moments between meetings, about how close the company had come to losing everything simply because 20 confident voices had agreed with each other, and how easily that agreement could have been mistaken for certainty rather than what it actually was. She began quietly changing how decisions were made throughout the company, insisting that any major recommendation include direct input from people working the actual front lines of the business, not just polished summaries handed up through layers of management. The culture inside Carter Dynamics started to shift in small, steady ways that took months to fully notice, but were unmistakable once they did. At the company's year-end gathering, held in the largest hall the company had ever rented for the occasion, with every employee in attendance and the energy in the room entirely different from the tension of a year before, Evelyn walked out onto the stage and told the story of that boardroom meeting from a year earlier, holding almost nothing back. She admitted, in front of the entire company, that if she had trusted the polished certainty of those 20 reports over the quiet, stubborn insistence of one man who actually understood the business from the ground up, Carter Dynamics might have lost its future entirely within a matter of months. She described the moment Daniel stood up when no one else did, the laughter that had briefly filled the room at his expense, and the way that laughter had slowly turned into silence and then, eventually, into something close to respect. She called Daniel up to join her on the stage, watching him hesitate for a moment near the edge of the crowd before walking forward, clearly uncomfortable with the attention suddenly aimed his way. The whole room rose to its feet in applause that lasted far longer than either of them had expected. Employees from every department standing together in a way the company had rarely seen before, some of them wiping away tears they had not expected to shed at a year-end meeting. Grace Whitfield stood near the front row, applauding as hard as anyone in the building, and Marcus Hale, watching from a screen set up at the factory site where he still worked, later said it was the first time in years he had felt genuinely proud to tell people where he worked. Daniel offered only a single line in response, his voix terra terrae despite the noise still settling around him, saying that he had never been against the consultants themselves, only convinced that data always needs to be checked against reality before anyone builds a decision on top of it. He added, almost as an afterthought, that he hoped the lesson would outlast the moment, that the company would keep asking hard questions long after the applause had faded and the story had stopped being retold at meetings. Evelyn then announced his new role to the entire assembled company, watching his expression shift from mild surprise to something quieter and more serious as the words landed. Chief Operations and Strategy Officer, with direct responsibility for shaping how every major decision at the company would be tested against what was actually happening on the ground, not merely what a report, however expensive, claimed was happening. The announcement drew another wave of applause, louder than the first. As people who had worked alongside Daniel for years finally saw him recognized in front of the entire organization, Evelyn looked out over the crowded room, waiting for the applause to settle before she spoke again, and said that expensive reports can often hand a company its fastest answer, but the future of a business is sometimes saved by the one person willing to ask the question nobody else wanted to ask out loud. She reminded the room that certainty, however confidently packaged and however many signatures stood behind it, was never the same thing as truth, and that the two could look identical right up until the moment they were tested against reality. As the applause rolled on for several long minutes, Daniel did not celebrate the way a man who had just won a great and public victory might be expected to. He simply stood there beside her, quiet, almost uncomfortable with the weight of so many eyes on him at once, because he understood, perhaps better than anyone else in that hall, that the point had never been proving himself right in front of a room that had once laughed at him for staying seated. The point had been helping a company see the truth before that truth slipped permanently out of reach. Before $400 million and thousands of jobs disappeared over an assumption nobody had bothered to question, Carter Dynamics moved forward into a new chapter after that year, rebuilt on steadier footing than it had known in a very long time, its culture quietly reshaped by a single meeting that almost nobody outside the company would ever fully understand. Years later, new employees joining the operations division would sometimes hear the story secondhand, retold slightly differently each time, though the core of it never changed. A single hand that stayed on the table while 20 others rose, and a company that came within a signature of losing its future. Some would treat it as legend. Others as a practical lesson, stitched permanently into how the company reviewed major decisions from that point forward, with a standing rule that no strategic recommendation could reach the board without input from at least 3 people working directly with customers on the ground. Daniel himself rarely told the story unprompted, preferring instead to let the results speak for whatever needed saying. Though he never once forgot the sound of that room laughing at him before it fell silent. And Evelyn carried with her, from that single meeting onward, the sharpest lesson of her entire career as a leader, one she would repeat in interviews and internal memos for years afterward. Real intelligence, she came to understand, rarely announces itself with a title, a diploma, or a reputation built over decades in rooms most people would never enter. It shows up quietly, often from the last person anyone expects, in the willingness to notice what everyone else has already overlooked, and the courage to actually listen when someone finally says it out loud. Somewhere in that lesson lived the whole story of Orion, of 20 confident voices and 1 quiet one, and of a company that very nearly chose comfort over truth before a single hand refused to rise with all the rest. Long after the headlines faded and the stock charts settled into their new, steadier rhythm, what people inside Carter Dynamics remembered most was not the number on a balance sheet, but the picture of one man standing quietly in a room full of certainty, willing to say the one sentence nobody else had been brave enough to say out loud. It became, in time, less a story people told about a single meeting, and more a quiet standard the company measured itself against, a reminder that agreement is easy to manufacture but truth almost always has to be found the hard way, one honest conversation at a time.